today, which was interesting. So thank you very much. Okay, so today we're moving on to looking at a few things which is for week 4, our class 4, and these are the things we're looking at. I'll give you a brief outline of the article by Laporta, which is in your additional readings, and that article is called Investor Protection and Corporate Governance. And following on from that, we'll go to the other readings in your books, which is 2 chapters. They were pretty easy reading on the small firms and also shareholder theory, and to talk about how the law perhaps has responded to those theories. And then I want to get your views on the Sahara case. You have lived and experienced it, and all of you would know something about it, much more than me. So I just distributed that little article with such a small print so you could test your eyes, so that we could talk about some of the corporate governance issues. But I'm really interested in just hearing how you have reacted to that. And finally, we'll go on to looking at minority protection, and there's a lot happening in India on minority protection, including the statutory derivative action, which is a really interesting process, and class actions. So before I start, let me ask you, are there any questions? Everyone's feeling really happy? Wonderfully peaceful? Sure, you are. Okay. So let's go on, and let's start looking at this argument in this article by Laporta. What was interesting here is that, I should say that Raphael Laporta, with a number of other colleagues, has done a study on how the political origins of a country, or the historical origins of a country, so judicial, political, historical, context of a country can determine the way in which corporate laws are actually implemented, or can determine their effectiveness. So one of the premises in this article, I should first say, did anyone read it, and do you have some views about it? Did anyone have a little look at it? Yeah. Do you want to start off telling us a little bit about a gut feeling? Sorry? Okay. All right. Anyway, so I thought this article was important to read now, because it kind of tells you about how the Indian Companies Act might face problems in the future in implementation. So I think it's pretty easy to say that passing a law is one thing, but the way in which it's going to be implemented is a completely different story. And also, the kind of law you actually bring into a country has got to have some thought. As we know, the British law has been dumped all over the world, and it is the predominant model. But is it as effective as it's expected to be in Britain and in those states such as America is really the question. What Porter points out is that there are different kinds. He tries to call it a family of legal systems, and he says there are many different families. So there is the common law family, which is the one India has, which comes from the UK, originates from the UK, the US, Australia. And then he says there is another family, which is the civil law, but the German civil law family is quite different to the French civil law family. And then there's the Scandinavian model. So he points out that each of these models have developed in a different way, responding to their historical, political, and social context. And he basically says that if you're going to try to understand how, so corporate governance is about balancing rights between outsiders and insiders. And outsiders are supposed to be investors. They can be debenture holders, creditors, secured, unsecured, and so forth. They could also be involuntary, sorry, no, they won't, we'll ignore them. Outsiders also obviously include tort victims. And insiders, the example of that, of course, is shareholders, but the law, as we've already discussed, gives a few priority interest to creditors. So what the corporations law here, Companies Act, and what corporate governance is doing is trying to balance this, and it really depends on the context. He tries to argue that what is really important for any country is contract law, but contract law only goes so far as defining the relationships within a company, as we discussed last class. What we need for outsiders is other laws. So we need laws such as one that protects investments, improves financial systems, gives bankruptcy laws, provides for maybe liquidation rights, receivership rights. So it's got to actually actively come from elsewhere. It can't really rely on contracts. On page 35, he points out that investor rights, such as voting rights of the shareholder and the reorganization of liquidation rights of creditors, are extensively well enforced by regulators or courts. If that is the case, then investors will come into the country. If you don't have enforcement, then they won't come into the country. So a lot of countries are being forced to adopt laws, including competition laws because of the WTO, and also they're forced to adopt corporations laws because global companies want them to. But enforcement is the difference. Adopting the law is one thing, and India is, of course, working towards all those laws. He proceeds to argue that if you're going to be looking at creating a reasonable system of, so let me just go back a minute. And he says, you can look at the history and try to figure out what kind of legal system or corporate governance system has been created, the historical origins. So he says, in civil law countries, the state government plays a much greater role in regulating business and providing than in common law countries. So the state is often in there telling the company what to do, whereas in common law countries there isn't that real intention or ambition. And he says that this is still the same, and in France, for example, much greater protection is given to people inside the company, so shareholders. And we also know about Germany that we have talked about before. There's an attempt at giving support to employees. But he says this is not really the case in common law countries. Now, he talks about what is an investor protection. So he says corporate governance is all about balancing these rights. But what you have to do is you have to give investors protection. And he takes a big view. Investors can include shareholders, and investors can include creditors, equity investors, debt investors. And he says, well, what kind of factors is going to play a part? Why do we need to do this? So firstly, he says, ownership control. So poor investment protection usually means that concentrated power groups within a company can end up controlling the company. So what he's really saying is if you don't give minority shareholders some rights, then the majority, or just even if they don't have the shares, 7%, as we learned before from Berlin Means, can end up controlling the whole company. And there'll be basically no real incentive for investors, new investors, to come in, because they know that whatever they put in, they'll just have to follow what that powerful management group does. He also says that this kind of laws that you create, investor protection, is really important in creating financial markets, in growing financial markets. Because he points out that if you have investor protection, then people are willing to invest. There are more listed public companies on the market. There is a really rich stock exchange, and you have more money available. And therefore, he links it up to economic growth. So basically, investor protection is necessary because it's corporate governance. It's trying to balance investor rights. What you need to do is protect shareholders' rights, minorities' rights, not just majority. And you also need to protect creditors' rights, because creditors' rights creates a flourishing financial sector, is what his point is. Now, if you look at India's history, we find that there is a lot written about it, and I'm sure you're aware of it. It's been suggested by particular authors, these authors Khanna and Palipu, that large-scale trading networks of merchants belonging to particular groups, and they put forth Marwari community and the Birla family, have been very important in forging political links through time. So they've been giving great big, donations to political parties, and those particular groups were very strongly linked with the Congress Party and managed to, of course, get political favors, including licenses to operate. So the point that they make is that, it's the other side of my lecture, is that this particular Tata family, Birla family, they argue that this means that smaller Indian businesses are quite volatile. They come into the market, but often they're kicked out, and there isn't a stable environment for them to continue. And they argue that large family business groups have continued to be dominant, and therefore they are able to have their voice heard much easily in the Indian marketplace. So that's the background that they put forth, this Laporta, and also that's supported by authors who have used Laporta and looked at the Indian market distribution. So the reason I bring that to your attention is basically there's no point just dumping a Corporations Act in a country that is new and has all the provisions. But it really matters to look at whether or not there is other supplementary provisions that support its implementation and effectiveness. So, that's basically didn't even go through those slides, but that's the sort of points I wanted to bring to your attention. Any questions? Do you agree with that, sir?
Don't you think that it is another sort of bribing the government to do their work? It's a quid pro quo relationship between them. If you do my job, you make the law according to which favors me, and I will give you the political favor and political contribution according to that. So, if after that it also hamper the competition law. You cannot make the market equal for all. So why we have this type of law which hampers the competition law and other sort of bribery in which we have?
That's a good question. Any answers? So the question is, why do we have these laws that actually you're arguing prohibit bribery when you have it as a widespread activity that has shaped corporate structures in the country?
Was the question on the bribery laws or on the system which was there under which licenses were given? See, the contribution is regarding the political contribution. You make a contribution to the the government who is in power, and for that you are wanting something in favor of you. So you made the law which favors me, and I will give the political contribution. Is it a direct sort of bribery?
All right.
And it also, by making the market according to you, you also kick out the other small corporate business. This is against the competition law.
Any takers? So I think it's an observation more than really a question. I suppose one can say that this has certainly played its way through history. The whole idea of competition is that the natural instinct of people is going to be to become a monopolist and to use everything in their power to become a monopolist. And competition law is all about stopping that natural instinct, to say that we know that's what you want to do, but we're going to try to stop it. But a competition law or a corporations law will not work if there isn't support for the regulator, and there isn't sufficient budget for the regulator, and there isn't a suitable court system. So if you have all those rule of law notions, the rule of law prerequisites, then it is quite possible that it'll go ahead. But as far as briberies are concerned, or donations are concerned, it's worldwide, isn't it? Isn't it just recently that Trump's company was giving his campaign quite a lot of money to continue, and he was using the separate legal entity concept?
Here the sponsorship is very high. Any company sponsored the political party, but here the contribution is given to the political party.
Okay. So maybe the point that should be made is there is a disclosure requirement in many countries where any donation to Parliament has got to be disclosed. And it's not just that. There's got to be people who act on it. So once it's disclosed, then you've got to question whether or not any legislation that's passed or any decision that's made is actually contrary to public interest and is actually a conflict of interest.
When you say bribe, that is something that operates as an extra legal phenomena and which is there in every such development, what you are looking for the government. What ma'am you also were mentioning regarding political contributions, the reason why provisions for political contributions are provided in companies and otherwise, and they all are disclosure provisions, right? To make sure that, okay, we know that monies are being paid, but if you are paying certain money, you have an obligation to disclose it. So you will disclose maybe say 7 crores if you have donated, and if we find in our investigation some more money change that, then that is private property. So that's a way of law to catch it. Other than that, on the article, ma'am, as you asked, one observation, though this paper I think was published in 2000, the observations, a lot of them I see are really pre-1991 and pre-liberalization of India, because license Raj, etc. were realities then. After that, our markets opened, not just to foreign investors, but also we deregulated a lot of commodities. Earlier, even manufacturing bread was regulated, now later on it was not. So, yes, and at that point, because it was only after that in the new age of Indian entrepreneurs and businesses, and today we are seeing startups that came up. But yeah, only on
that article isn't about India.
Yeah.
This is another article that's about the history of India, written. But yes. But thank you. So you're saying that in the last years, the entrepreneurial push has been extraordinary, especially with IT, and that has been raising the profile of India, and companies even such as Tata have been very good at entrepreneurial spirit and attracting capital. So thank you. Yes, that is quite true. I agree with that. Okay, so I guess all I'm trying to say is let's look at law in context. Let's look at law in the context of a country's history and its ability to actually engage in economic growth. Okay, so the next thing is about the readings that's in your main handout, and that is just the 2 chapters that out of the textbook. And I thought we could maybe look at, why have I got that there? I'll just go back to this. I thought maybe we can have a look at the questions, which is just a couple of questions to keep to time, which is on page 86 of the first chapter. And that question says, what stakeholder groups might directors of a company have to take into consideration, and how might these interests impact on the company? So I put up here some of the stakeholders. I'm not only suggesting these, but I thought maybe we can just look at the kinds of stakeholders that might matter with making these decisions. So the first is creditors. So how are creditors regulated? We've discussed this before, and I just put a couple of sections up, which is that 447 that we already know of the Companies Act, which is the fraud section. And anything else? Does anyone want to tell me about companies that are actually going into insolvency? How do creditors' rights get articulated there?
So companies that are going into insolvency, traditionally there's been 2 sort of remedies, common law remedies, and that those include the concept of administration, and it doesn't really exist in India, but traditionally under the Companies Act, a company that would go insolvent would be liquidated and the assets sold, and then creditors would obviously, secure creditors would get the highest preference, along with the employees, and then there'll be trickle down concept where whatever will be left over will go down to the next section. Shareholders are the last in terms of the remedies. Now there's a new Insolvency Act, the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, which passed earlier this year, and where a company becomes insolvent, a process called the insolvency resolution process is triggered, and that's where the creditors, the secure creditors, become a committee. That's what the creditors committee, and they're empowered to make decisions regarding the future course that the company needs to take. They can make decisions as to if any assets have to be sold. They can come up with plans for rehabilitation of the company, and so they're empowered to take care of them. So they sort of act as a de facto board of the company, with the way the professional or the insolvency professional taking care of the day-to-day matters. Once they have come up with a plan, it's been passed by a certain majority, or 75% of the creditors. The company accepts the plan, and the board is re-established, and the company goes back to being an ongoing concern and implementing the plan.
Thank you. Excellent. So the main point that's being made there, firstly, is that the creditor's rights only really come into effect or articulated where there is difficulties, where there's some kind of insolvency. In that case, as pointed out under the new Act, a group of creditors are able to be established to manage the company, a committee. I think we call it schemes of arrangement, and we have voluntary administration as well, which can do either things. So voluntary administration, you can have it, so if the company succeeds, it can go ahead. If it doesn't succeed, then it can be wound up. You can have two options. So let's just go back and say that the idea here is that the rights of creditors come into effect in difficulties. Otherwise, there's an overall provision, of course, 447, that if there is some kind of fraud, they can also come into being. I just wanted to look at an alternative approach, which is in Australia, and it's also in the UK, and that is that at all times the corporate veil can be lifted to attach liability to the directors of the company. But, so even when the company is a going concern, where there are reasonable grounds to expect the company is insolvent. So the company could be a going concern, and in circumstances where the company can't pay its debts, or there are reasonable grounds to suspect it cannot pay its debts, then the officer could be personally liable to the creditor. And what the Section V does, 588V, is it does the same lifting of the corporate veil in a parent company, subsidiary company relationship. So it's able to actually make the parent company liable for the debts of the subsidiary company where there are reasonable grounds. So the point here is the reasonable ground test, that it doesn't have to be that there is actually belief in the mind of the officer that the company can't pay its debts. The officer might be a buoyant, optimistic, entrepreneurial person who really thinks that after this little hump, everything is going to be so smooth. But it's not that. It's what a reasonable person would think. So they're trying to say if a reasonable person feels that it's too difficult, then the director is liable. The reason I put this forth is it's not in the aftermath like the Indian 447. This is all through the conducting of the affairs that the corporate veil can be lifted. And the other thing is, unlike 447, it's also compensation that's payable by the director. So the director isn't just subject to a fine, the director has to pay compensation to the parties. And the people who are going to go after the director is usually big companies. Right? So, and if so that the director is a bit shaky, it's really kind of pretty good to keep the director on their toes, because they can be wiped out. And of course, as you know, as we've already talked about, sure, the director might just be a $1 director without, and all the assets have disappeared. But once you're a bankrupt, as in the Australian law, you can't be a director again of any company. So that is a deterrent.
The section only applies to debts which have been incurred once the company has either become insolvent or there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the company might be insolvent. Right? So if there were any debts incurred prior to that, then you won't really make the director liable. So this is only when the company is either insolvent and the director continues to trade, or there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the company has become insolvent.
So what usually happens in these instances is there's a period of time where the director is really trying to get the company out of trouble before it becomes really evident. And in that period of time, between reasonable grounds to suspect insolvency and creditors realizing there's insolvency, it's shaky grounds. That's where the temptation is, to try to do something that isn't necessarily in the interests of shareholders. Maybe to give priority to some creditors who are yelling louder. Maybe to borrow some money from a parent company and pay off some creditors. Maybe to shift some assets from the subsidiary to the parent company to hide it. That's the period when they can do it. So this is all the transactions that can be queried, even though the company might be back in the black. So in that circumstance, the company becomes a going concern again, but during that shaky time, where someone's interests might have been ignored, the action can be brought. So I think it's a little bit tighter than what you're suggesting.
So what our friend suggested is the framework provided under the Companies Act, that if seeking to the first time on creditor protection. So one way is to apply for a voluntary winding up or ask winding up for non-payment of debt. If the creditor or the class of creditor we are talking about happens to be a bank, in India they have some special rights under special legislations, which is the recovery of debt due to bank and financial institutions. So these legislations were brought in after 1993, when the government realized that while there are provisions in the Companies Act, but still the only other remedy available is to go into civil courts, which always have pendency and other problems. So they came up with this special act under which special tribunals were established, called the Debt Recovery Tribunals, DRTs, under which if your creditor is a bank, it can go and enforce its right as a specific forum. And subsequently in 2002 a stricter law called SARFAESI was introduced, which gives after which the creditor actually has the right of going and taking possession of the secured assets, and it need not wait for the bank, for the court or for the tribunal to pass an order of attack. So other than Companies Act, when we say creditor protection, these two legislations are special legislations which also exist.
Thank you. Okay. So the difference is that section 558 is lifting the corporate veil. It's not the liability of the company, it's the liability of the individual. That's the difference. All right. So I was just thinking about other stakeholders. So the other stakeholder is communities. Any comment? Do you think that's reasonable in the readings that you did? Can communities, do you think, be taken into account? And if so, how? Do you want to say anything? Oh. Okay. Well, any of those. Communities, pension funds.
Section 135 of the Companies Act, it talks about the CSR, that is corporate social responsibility. And the communities should be taken into consideration because the companies which are located in that region, where the community is situated, that company should provide education, employment, as well as all the other facilities which is required for day-to-day life. If the company is not working in an environment-friendly manner or not coping up with the needs, then if the company declines data, then the communities will ultimately be affected because these local schools will be established there, then the employment, all these things will be affected. So the company should work in an environment-friendly way, taking into consideration the national concerns as as well as the money.
Yeah. Anyone else? Everybody think that's cool? Is that happening, do you think? Any of those interest groups? Any views? Okay. I suppose the biggest group that seems to be coming up, maybe if I can take you there, is pension funds. So maybe I should just give a little bit of background about pension funds, and that is that pension funds are the superannuation funds, you know, that all the university lecturers, all the civil servants, everybody has. They're putting money aside for old age. And in Western countries, in developed countries, if you can't have a pension fund, your own fund that is giving you the money, usually you can go and get a pension from the state. It's not enough to live on, but it's usually below the poverty line, but it's something. So most developed countries are basically at a state, having an enormous problem that if the pension funds don't do well and don't take care of their contributors, the state is going to be liable. So there is a great desire by governments in the developed world to try to get these pension funds to actually make money. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, yeah? Because if they make money, then they'll give a good pension, then the people will be able to live off that, then the state doesn't have to give them social security. But the problem is, yes?
The problem would be what if they invest the fund somewhere and when the money goes away, they're not able to recover a penny out of it, the investment, they go bankrupt. So wouldn't that improve the entire burden rather than increasing it? Very risky in the GIAN invest the pension fund.
Yeah. Sorry, the question is they might invest in a company that goes broke.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a problem.
Give us a couple cases of investments that are less risky. The first thing we learn about are institutional investors investing like pension funds, for instance, because they're traditionally seen as the couple being not risky investment because you're playing with people's fingers.
Okay. It's a bit of a big topic, so I'm sort of trying to cover it simply. Maybe I can tell you a little story about this pension fund in the Pacific where I work, we do a lot of work. There's a pension fund in Vanuatu that's set up, and it's a beautiful country. It's set up to get money for all the civil servants. But the pension fund is so poorly managed, it lends money to people because the pension fund gets contributions every salary and puts it in, but they've got to invest it to make money. They can't just sit on top of it, right? They've got to invest it somewhere. And this pension fund is so poorly managed that the chief executive officer has actually taken a lot of money and he's bought his own house in Australia with the pension fund. So it's actually hopeless. Does that make sense? So of course, he's bought this house in Australia. How is he going to repay? And what sort of interest rate is he repaying? So if pension funds are well managed, they'll make more money and they'll be able to take care of their contributors. So the point that you make is if pension funds put investments in companies that go broke, their contributors won't do well. So the aim of most governments is to make sure that pension funds put money into companies and make sure those companies are viable. Does that make sense to people? So pension funds are getting money from all of you when you get jobs. You'll be putting into a pension fund. The pension fund gets all that money, and what's it going to do with it? It can't just sit on it. So it's got to invest it in companies. Now, till now, pension funds just invested it in companies and kept quiet. But now governments are telling pension funds, you better take care of what you're doing. You better take care of the investments you're making. So what is happening now is pension funds are becoming a very important stakeholder in corporate governance. So if it's a big publicly listed company, invariably a pension fund will be investing in it. And where a pension fund invests in it, go back to Berlin means, remember 7% gets control. A pension fund will often have 2 or 3% of a company. And they have a big say. So institutional shareholders, such as pension funds or even funds managers, are becoming very important in corporate governance. And I just put that Hermes code up, which is in your readings. And the code is stating that it's essential for pension funds to act in a reasonable manner and to do monitoring. Many countries have made it compulsory for pension funds to vote. So this is going back, after our discussion, I'm not really sure if it's a nudge or not, but this is going back to a strategy of regulating pension funds to have good governance systems and getting pension funds to disclose how they're actually taking care of their contributors' incomes. By doing that, pension funds are now becoming hawks of companies.
Just a suggestion. Be sure about the safety of pension fund. Is it possible that the pension funds are invested in government projects so that they are safe, government gets money, and it can be paid at a reasonable interest, way more safer than investing in a private company?
Yeah, a pension fund can do that, but usually it's not a big enough market just to invest in government infrastructure, and it's a low interest rate. So they've got to balance that up. But yes, you're quite right. Okay, so they're becoming important, and environmental groups are also becoming important, as we know, because they're talking up a lot and complaining about things. So one example is, you think, oh, well, what do environmental groups do? Well, environmental groups can do a lot. There is an environmental group called Banktrack, which has a dirt file. And that dirt file is constantly saying what kind of activities banks are engaged in and exposing investments that banks are engaged in that's causing, environmental damage, human beings' health damage, and so forth. So it's trying to attract customers to this debate and trying to get governments as well to try to get into the act. So, for example, there are a number of banks in Australia that invest in Solomon Islands in companies, and those companies are involved in logging. And what the environmental group does is expose this with photographs, with stories, with interviews, and says, look, you think that you're just investing in a company that's perfectly fine, but in fact it's deforestation. And what has happened is that a number of banks have then had to respond, and they've had to pull the investment out. So they've had to say, sorry, but we have signed up to the Equator Principles. The Equator Principles means that we believe in sustainable lending. I think there are like 100 banks, financial institutions that have signed up to the Equator Principles. So we can't really go around lending to companies that are going to be engaged in deforestation. So they've had to cancel the loan and call it back. So it is possible for environmental groups to also react. Anyway, I know that usually around fourth class people get a bit bored, so let me just go a bit faster. Oh, that's finished. Oh yeah, maybe I can get you to tell me about the Sahara case. Do you all know about it? I was talking to my colleagues about it yesterday who are here for the project, and they said, oh, don't worry, they'll know all about it. You can't tell them about it. They have to tell you. So I thought I'd better ask you what happened, how did it play out, because it's a corporate governance case. And at the back of that little handout I included, there are some issues, corporate governance issues that are raised. So I thought perhaps you could tell me about that case, and we could talk about how any of that could be dealt with by the Corporations and so the Companies Act. I know that you guys would know about it because you seem very, like, I mean, the whole all of India seems well connected with current affairs. So maybe I can ask, I don't want to force anyone. Maybe I can ask you to tell me about the facts. All I know is that the lead man has written another book and has just come out of jail. Does anyone know about this? I know you all do. What about you? Do you want to start?
Both of them are unlisted, and they started racking up money from the public by issuing convertible debentures, which actually were not allowed by SEBI. So it so happens that the SEBI comes across a discrepancy of around 24,000 crores, and they asked to repay it along with 15% interest, which the company is not able to do. So as a result, they are, the director is put into jail and the entire thing is gone. Another thing that has come across is out of 24,000 crores, they were returning it, right? So people have to come forward to take their money, out of which only 2,000 or 3,000 actual investors came forward, and it came to light that this actually was a whole scam for money laundering. This is the biggest scam that India has ever seen for money laundering. So that is the only problem. Yeah, that's the entire issue.
Thank you. Anyone else like to add to that? So what corporate governance issues come out of those facts? Firstly, you might want to elaborate on it. Yes? Would you like to say something? Oh, you want to say something? Great. Do.
Ma'am, the main issue which came, like they were saying that the debenture is not the part of the they were mainly dealing with the OFCD thing. So and they talked and they said that the debentures are not the part of the company and the SEBI regulations. So the SEBI comes up and says that if you will go with the debentures, they are the hybrid debentures which can be converted into the shares, as they were dealing with the equity, and so they deal with the section, mainly section 2 clause 45 subclause A subclause A, and which says that which describes about the other securities and what is the debentures which is in the section 2 clause 12 of the Companies Act, and it mainly, they said that the Companies Act doesn't applicable on them, and they said that they are clearly violating the Companies Act of section 67, section 76 of the Companies Act. So that's the main issues which is covering, and they were again and again saying that we don't have to comply with the SEBI regulations, that they are not dealing what SEBI deals with. So that's
Okay. So a couple of issues have been raised. The first is the fact that there was not sufficient monitoring of what the company was actually doing. So really, was there anyone asking questions within the company? And the second is the regulator themselves seems very weak and not able to take action and not able to force action. Any other points you want to make? So how did you read about the case in the press? Anyone?
So basically, in that case, they are regularly issuing the OFCD in the form of
So what do you think? Do you think it can happen again?
Basically, in the 2012 saga, this scam is the same thing, ma'am. That they create the conglomeration of the company, they create around 200 of the company, and again they create the bubble around that with the and SEBI regularly telling to the government that something is going wrong, but they are not disclosing. Either they are creating and they are taking the money for the one company, they are again creating the again company as company around 200 more than 200 companies they create, take the investment of that. It's a private company. Again that the bubble trust and the
Okay. So related party transactions. So there's a whole lot of moving funds from one company to another. All right. Again, unregulated. All right. So money laundering, no exercise of skill, conflict of interest, there's actually deceit involved, and none of it is actually being regulated. Yes, sir? Do you want to explain?
that it's a optional fully convertible debenture. That is it's the up to the debenture holder whether he wants to convert that debenture into a shareholding capacity or not. If you don't wish to convert that debenture, then you can simply debenture is something that it is like it's a acknowledgement of their debenture is like so.
Yes, it can be seen as a loan, but it's a document.
It's a document. So it's up to you whether you want to convert or not.
Okay, any comments? Shall we go through this list of the corporate governance points that were raised? So, illegal issue of shares. There's actually, you brought up the money laundering issue. There's illegal issue of shares, and well, there's supposed to be prospectus regulations that one has to follow. Clearly that hasn't been followed. And of course, fraud, the fraud provisions work because it says there are creation of fictitious investors. It points out that the registrar of companies didn't do their job. It talks about political links with the party in power. And it talks about inflated value of different assets. All those things would be breaches of duties of directors, and all those things should be picked up by a regulator. So I suppose one has to ask the question, is the regulator effective? And does the regulator actually have sufficient funds to police conduct and to take action quickly? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is there enough actual shareholders within the company to query anything? Or is it so much lacking in transparency, which is what it's set up for, that this kind of querying can't happen? So do you think this is going to happen again?
There were a ton of issues in here. One of them, the one regarding OFCDs, was largely because the old companies act and really talk about hybrids. So they talked about shares and they talked about debentures, and they said if you have to issue these to the public, there has to be public offer and it has to be regulated by the Securities and Exchange Board of India in the form of an IPO. Now what these guys went and did was that they said, well, we're neither issuing shares nor debentures, and the Companies Act requires us to have a public issue only if we're issuing shares or debentures, we're issuing something else. That might not happen again because the new Companies Act has a broad classification of shares and debentures and hybrids, and they've termed it as securities. So it's harder to say these aren't securities because the definition is largely expansive. So that issue might not happen again, but the rest of them, money laundering, related party transactions, all of them might happen again.
Okay, I suppose it raises an important issue about the complexity of regulating companies as well. The quicker the regulator moves, the quicker the company itself moves to devise other kind of products. And that isn't just trying to be sneaky, it's trying to meet a demand. There is innovation within the corporate financing models, and that's something that should be promoted. So what one finds is the regulators really don't even understand, for example, why the GFC happened, why the crashes happened. They don't know how to stop it. You know, they don't know how the codes that is written in Wall Street to sell shares work. So it is a really complicated area, very, very difficult to regulate. One has to also give that some recognition. Usually what responsive regulation states is if you're going to have something like that, the regulator has got to be in constant touch with the market, and they've got to be responding through guidelines, which SEBI is doing, on a regular basis, and try to be a lot more approachable and have a lot more investigatory powers. So it is something that's going to be difficult to police because there is a lot of innovation that's happening, and it's going to be a hard job for the regulator. So it's just some sympathy for SEBI as with the American and Australian regulators. Thank you. Now let me go on to just putting down basically the regulatory overview of companies. We were talking before about hard laws and soft laws, if you remember. And it's just that the top is miserably hard laws and the blue is miserably soft laws. So you've got the listing rules for public companies, takeover code, and you've got all those voluntary guidelines that have been issued by SEBI, which is trying to encourage corporate social responsibility, or it's supposed to encourage corporate governance, then encourage sort of practices about recognizing not just economic but other also goals when a corporation functions. So the reason I put that up is to try to say that all the bottom is not mandatory, they're all voluntary. So there's no punishment involved in those. There's just encouragement to abide by them. But usually if you don't have stakeholders who are willing to question whether a company is working on that, it's not going to actually happen. But there's just those voluntary notions that one has to remember. Now I want to move on to looking at just minority rights. And to start off, the old outdated theory that we talked about is this notion of the organs of the company being the board of directors and, of course, shareholders in a general meeting. But we know there are other people, other stakeholders that work, as we've been looking at. This is the outmoded way of thinking. But still, what's happening is the rules, they know that the board of directors make a whole lot of decisions. It's an organ of the company. But all the rules that have developed is to control the board of directors. The general meeting of shareholders, it's understood that that's another organ of the company, but it's also understood that minorities don't have a say. It's only majority that has a say. And it's recognizing that minority shareholders have to be protected. The main development in corporate governance for quite a long time, most probably at least 60 or 70 years, has been to balance the rights of the majority and the minority. What do the majority shareholders want and what do the minority want? Why are they at odds? It's a question I just wanted to ask you. So what is it that the majority shareholders and minority shareholders, when will they be at odds? When will the minority want something the majority doesn't want? I just wanted to ask you that because that's how we understand when their rights should be recognized. Can you think of instances why a minority shareholder might not want to actually support the majority view? Okay, let me give you an example. Maybe there's a green shareholder. green, as in environmentally conscious shareholder, and they don't want to support a particular move by a company. So they might not really, they might completely oppose that. So that's just a innocuous sort of thing. What about if there's a block of shareholders and they basically want to sell the shares, their shares, to another company for a takeover? The minority mightn't want that, and the minority might object because the majority just want to sell it. Any other reasons? There might be a conflict of interest that the majority is engaged in. The majority shareholder might have a director who's leading them, who has set up another company, and they actually want to engage that company as consultants for a period of 3 years. The minority might become aware of it and may want to stop it. So there are many reasons why minorities may not want to do that. Also, the minority shareholder might want to be bought out. And the minority shareholder might think, I'll just make as much trouble as possible for the majority so that they'll actually pay me out. Might be green mailing them.
They are asking for the minority right, being the majority act unreasonably to take the decision. So when anyhow the company runs on the basis of the majority decision. So where how the minority right should be protected and where the.
Okay, so yeah, that's a good segue to the next slide. So there are 4 main ways in which minority rights are protected under the legislation. The first 2, the smallholder protection and the restructure, are quite minor. The oppression remedy existed under the old law, but the statutory derivative action under 245 is something new and interesting. So let's have a look at this. Firstly, the basic one, which is, so just to come back, I just wanted to reiterate that minority protection, so I just want to reiterate that a company we were talking about yesterday, someone said, who cares what happens within a company? It's a private concern. Why should they be taking note of anything outside? But law is not just about commerce and facilitating commerce, it's also about justice. And what it tries to do is introduce some voice in certain circumstances to the minority shareholder. So it says, in some circumstances, maybe the minority shareholder should actually be protected because they're so tiny, they can be ignored, and the majority could quash them. So what is happening is that idea of just a right to be heard and a right to be represented has come out in common law. Under the common law, certain rights were recognized, particularly oppression, which is that if you're going to be oppressed, if for some reason you were going to be treated really unfairly, so for example, they don't send you notice of the meeting. They keep you out of every decision because they don't want you troubling them. Because you might be noisy. You're a really noisy person. Every general meeting you put your hand up and ask awful questions. They might be doing it for that reason. The common law decided that kind of activity shouldn't happen and they'd protect the little guy. And they would let his interests be heard. But some of the other provisions are going beyond that. It's not just about oppression, it's about something more. Just before I go to that, I want to explain something again. Remember, a company is a separate legal entity. And remember, the directors are behind the company. And that is the corporate veil. Remember that? These guys are not liable. Okay? Now, what we're talking about here is minorities. So, So the minorities, I better put a few more. The minorities are trying to bring an action. Now, what the minorities can complain in certain instances. So let's have a look firstly at the definition of a minority isn't given. We're just presuming it's less than 50%, but every section goes through it and explains it in a different way. So firstly, there is that small protection under section 151, which is pretty simple. It just applies to listed companies, and it just says that a listed company may have one director elected by small shareholders. And small shareholders means a shareholder holding a nominal value of not more than 20,000 rupees. So it's supposed to be actually just giving a right to small shareholders to have their voice heard within the corporation. So that is going completely against this notion that it's only the majority, it's only private. It's actually just recognizing that small shareholders may be in a vulnerable position. Their interests may never actually be represented, and putting somebody on the board of directors out of 15 mightn't mean much of a big public company, but somebody who can actually talk about what happens and how their interests should be protected. Any views on that? Do you think that's fair? What do you reckon?
Sounds like an excellent plan to have some sort of formal representation in the board for the minority shareholders, which might not collectively, individually, or even collectively have a voice and be able to express their concerns to the
But it's quite different, isn't it? It's making listed companies actually listen to small shareholders, which they don't normally have to do. It is creating a voice for certain groups. So it's something a little bit consciously not playing to the usual. The second component is dealing with, I suppose, the situation of green mail. Let me just tell you a case in Australia, which is a Gambotto case, which caused a lot of problems. So this guy was a really noisy, basically a pain. He was a professional litigant and a vexatious litigant. And he also had a bit of money. He was retired. He had quite a lot of knowledge. And he was basically, I suppose he didn't have any family life. He just really liked to be heard. So he used to go to every meeting, put his hand up and ask lots and lots of questions. And go about asking extraordinary amount of questions and slowing down the process of the company operations. He only held 0.03% of shares. 0.03. The other one shareholder held 99% of shares, and there were lots of other little shareholders who held the balance. So the company decided that it would be advantageous for them to go into becoming one company with one shareholder, not all these multiple shareholders. So they decided to buy back the shares. 99% obviously of shareholders voted to buy back the shares. The other shareholders also agreed because they were offered a reasonable deal, but Gambotto did not. Gambotto said, no, 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 tough luck. My share is a right to hold a share. It's a great right to go to meetings, to put my hand up and talk. I'm not giving up that right. It's a property right. I can never give it up. The court had to come up with deciding what that means, and the court decided that a share is a property right, but the only rights it carries is the right to vote, and it also carries the right to receive a dividend. It does not really carry anything else, such as permanently holding the share. And the court, however, said, but he doesn't want to give up the share, so you have to offer him a good price. They said, it's clear that there's green mail involved. He is trying to get money out of the company and trying to get a very high price. And the court said, well, sorry, but what you're doing is unfair. It is oppressing him. He doesn't want to sell. So you've got to actually work with him. soon after they included an amendment like this amendment, which basically says if one shareholder has, or a group of shareholders has 90% of issued capital, then they can actually buy the others out. So the rationale of it, what is the rationale for introducing this provision? Well, it's firstly to stop greenmail, as was happening in Gambodo.
So, there was exploitation of the company. This time, other shareholders were the companies.
Yeah. So the idea is maybe the company has rational grounds for deciding, especially if 90% are going to operate, then it should be able to go about and do this. So what's interesting is that the restructure is actually protecting the rights of 90%, whereas the small director is actually protecting the rights of really, really small shareholders. So it's at odds. Both things seem to be covered. Yeah.
Does the law now provide for a mandatory squeeze out?
In Australia? Yeah.
Okay.
Not a man. Yes.
They have exactly a similar.
That is no. That is your provision.
Because,
Yeah.
For us, it's still not mandatory squeeze out.
No, it's a vote.
Yeah.
Same.
As a matter of practice, because having drafted some of the settlement agreements myself, we have shareholders who have 1 or 2 shares. They come into meetings, do all the Allah possible, send notices for calling meetings, etc. Eventually, let the promoters come and enter into private agreements with them, and then some commission is paid. And because we have paid the promoter paying so much money, they want it to be written somewhere. So we arrive at some sort of settlement and notice agreement. So that is backing also. It is still a practice.
Yeah. So that's why this provision is a good thing.
It's very helpful. Even the new act doesn't provide.
That is a new act. All right. So the other one that we talked about is oppression. So just going back to that slide, is the restructure is under section 235. That should be and, sorry. I forgot to press the shift button. And 236, we've done that. You see there's a little bit of an odd rationale covering all bases.
These are hard laws or soft laws?
Hard laws. And then there are these two provisions. For this provision, I just want to explain something, and that is why I drew this thing. So for oppression, the idea is if the minority shareholders are oppressed, they can bring an action against the company. Okay? I just want to go back to this notion of separate legal entity. And just we'll use people to illustrate this. So you are the separate legal entity, and you two are the directors. Okay? So these guys are actually shareholders. They know that that particular director is employing all the family in the business. And all the family is getting huge salaries in the business. And they're hiding behind the company. These guys want to actually stop that. But he is a majority shareholder. And he is married to that director. So the point is, when these minority shareholders try to raise it, he blocks them. And if there's any vote, he votes for continuing that practice, because it's his kids as well that are being employed and all his family. So lovely. So these guys are furious. They're the little white knights, the goody two-shoes who want to clean up the world of the corporate world and stop that person doing all the things she's doing. What can they do? They are minority shareholders. They hold less than 50% of shares. All they really want to get at these guys. They want to get at her. Make you more beautiful. A little bit of hair. Okay, so they want to get at her, but they can't because of the corporate veil. But oppression laws recognise that sometimes, and also one other thing, the only person who can bring an action against her is the company. The company is a separate legal entity. This wrong of employing all the family is a wrong done to the company, right? Because the company is a separate legal entity. So if anyone is going to sue her, it's got to be the company that sues her. There's no way the company is going to sue her because the majority shareholder won't let it happen. So she's protected. So these guys, what can they do? They can exit the company and put their money elsewhere. They can make a complaint, but they might see their stock price fall if they get the press and if they get SEBI acting, which will hit their back pocket. They can also have a remedy, and this remedy has basically been introduced by the common law to try to attend to this kind of oppressive conduct. So it's called oppressive conduct and mismanagement. Usually it doesn't deal with mismanagement generally, just deals with oppression. So the common law origins of oppression are that it's supposed to be something that is not just treating people slightly badly, but oppressive is very badly. It's trying to treat people in a prejudicial way. The common law cases seem to indicate that someone screaming at you seemed to be oppression. Not giving you information continuously is oppression. Harassing you is oppression. But the statute law has moved away from that really strong terms. The statute law had it in 397 and now it's in 241, 244. So let's have a look at who can bring this action. That's in section 241, which says that it's got to be a shareholder. What the Act refers to is a member. They call shareholders members, and any shareholder can bring such an action under subsection 2411, and also the government can bring such an action. Why, on what basis can they bring the action? Well, they've got to show that the affairs are being conducted in a manner that's prejudicial or oppressive or prejudicial to the public interest or in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the company. What's interesting about the Act is it talks about prejudicial to the public interest. This provision isn't usually in the common law and isn't also in the Australian and the UK one. This idea that prejudicial to the public interest is something new they've stuck in here. So it could be that the phrase what I'm trying to say is that it could be prejudicial to the interests of the company, but also it could be not interest of the company, but prejudicial to the public interest. So I don't know if it's a drafting error, which will be clarified later, or whether it goes hand in hand with recognizing the rights that the duties that directors owe to the company and to the community. The directors owe to the company, the community, to the environment, and to employees. So I don't know if that particular provision that directors owe a duty to the community is also being recognized as public interest. So there's a great deal more involvement of the state in this provision. They go to the tribunal, and the remedies, that's where the persons who have been oppressed have to go. And the remedies are in section 242 and 243. Now, what's interesting here is the remedies are really wide and, and they're kind of all over the place, really. The remedies can be terminating the managing director, for example. So if the court is convinced that that particular managing director is breaching their duty, and these people are quite right in being oppressed, these guys are right, then they can actually ask for the termination of the managing director. So they're going behind the corporate veil, which is something that the common law wouldn't do, but the statute does. Also, they could say, look, that's fine, these guys are really complaining, so you buy the shares at a certain price. So there's a share buyout. That's also possible. There's also possible if the company is actually small and it looks like these guys don't want to sell the shares to wind up the company. That remedy also exists for the tribunal under subsection B of section 242. It also means removing managing directors, paying compensation is another thing. So there is a whole lot of remedies that are provided for the minority. But there are some problems, and it isn't as clear as it seems. Firstly, there is a threshold requirement that has to be satisfied under this section. That requirement is in section 244, and it says that the case of the company, there has to be 100 members or 1/10 of the total number of shares. So the problem is these two guys wouldn't be 100 members and they might not have 1/10 of the total number of shares, which means the action isn't possible. Of course, it's slightly different for a company not having a share capital, which we won't go there. But the point that's being made is the provision cannot be used in all instances, so there are problems with the threshold. The other thing is the orders that can be made. Sure, the orders can be made, but who is actually policing whether those orders are actually complied with? There is a provision that says if the order isn't made, you actually have to pay some sort of fine, but it's such a small fine. Where is it? It is 1 lakh of rupees if you don't obey the order. So that is such a small fine that you wonder how effective it's going to be. Now, the other thing is it goes to the tribunal, which might kind of be really clogged up, and it mightn't be able to deal with the action easily. So it's a little bit on, and the other, yeah, so it might be that we have to wait and see how it's going to be interpreted. There are some common law cases that require that the person who goes to court to complain of oppression goes with clean hands, because it's an equitable remedy. So the person has to go with clean hands. So if these guys have also been engaged in certain breaches or certain kinds of improper conduct, you know, they can't actually go and ask the court for a remedy. So there's a few problems about interpretation which we'll undoubtedly see in good time. Yeah.
On the threshold, feature which came under the new legislation.
This is the new legislation.
Yeah, I saw it. I was trained in the old one, so this is the new legislation, which is that there is a provision in 244. If you see, so first the conditions are laid down of 1/10 of 100 members, and then there is a proviso that in certain situations, if the tribunal is convinced, it can also allow a lesser number of members to come and file, which is not there in the earlier act.
So the discretion is increased.
Discretion is given to tribunal that even if it is below 1/10 or 100, it can still hear them, which is a good provision.
True. All right. Any?
Regarding the operation of the company, can that be treated as a whistleblower? I need that.
Oh yes, so if it's a listed company, the codes of conduct require all listed companies to adopt a whistleblower provision within their practice. Yes, so he has to themselves classify themselves as whistleblowers. All they're doing now, all they want to do, right? Yes, they could become whistleblowers if it's a listed company. But what we're talking about right now is oppression. But yes, you're quite right. They could perhaps go and... No. A whistleblower isn't seeking compensation for themselves. A whistleblower is seeking compensation for, is bringing to light some practices within the entity. in this instance of oppression, it's all about the rights of these individuals who are not treated well. The whistleblower is about the company's full conduct. It's completely different objectives.
So what my question is that if the number is below 1 day, then he cannot able to raise his voice regarding the misoperation or mismanagement. So if again if he raise the voice, then he is the treated as a whistleblower. So anyway he raise the voice and the witness lies only that in the case of whistleblower he cannot get the compensation. In the case of mismanagement or misoperation, he get the compensation. Is it so?
Well, it's like asking if it's a shareholder, can he be a creditor? I mean, it's two different things. You have to go back to these guys and ask them, do they want to blow the whistle? If they want to do that, then they can become whistleblowers. That's an option open to them. But it brings with it completely different issues. It's not, they want to stay as shareholders of the company and they want to get compensation. Okay? All right, I'll come to whistleblowers next class. If you look at the materials, I've put an article on whistleblowers for you to read on the American legislation as well as your own provisions. Okay, now the statutory derivative action is something that's new in this Act, and the statutory derivative action is doing something that's really quite fascinating. Under the common law, if anyone, usually the minority, wanted to bring an action against directors, anyone, if shareholders wanted to bring an action against directors, they had to use a general meeting, pass a resolution, and the company had to bring an action against the director. So that was the common law. It's Foss and Harbottle, old boring case, that actually makes that rule. But we already know that in the oppression remedy, you can go around it and get a remedy that's lifting the corporate veil, and that happens all the time in the legislation. However, what this does is, this does something further. If you can work and succeed in convincing the court that it's a statutory derivative action, then what you're doing is the minority shareholders, usually, because if it's a majority shareholder, they'd have passed a resolution to make the company to do this. So it's usually a minority that is doing this, will bring the action in the name of the company against the director. So this isn't actually anything more than giving you a right to bring an action in the name of the company against the director for breach of duties. So the aim is to be able to act because the majority are involved in a fraudulent conduct. So to go back to our situation, these two guys are in the minority. They want to bring an action, but they can never make the company to engage in this action because they don't have the shares. So this particular provision, if you convince the court that it's the provisions, if you convince the requirements of the provision, then you can bring an action in the name of the company. So that's section 245. It's widely worded. What does it mean? Well, again, it's 100 members and not less than such a percentage as is prescribed. So the company itself can give a prescription, and in the case of a company without a share capital is 1/5. As we said, that's a different thing, but the general rule is 100 members have to get together to be able to bring an action. What do they have to show? They have to show that the affairs of the company are being conducted in a manner that's prejudicial to the interests of the company as a whole. So in this case, the fact that there's a conflict of interest happening behind the company is clearly something that's prejudicial. So this will be able to work, and it'll be something that's the affairs of the company isn't being conducted in a way that's prejudicial. And you can go and get the orders that are in section 2451, which is, it can also include bringing an action, but it can also include amending some sort of articles or memorandum that might have entrenched the rights of people, because articles can be used to entrench rights. So there might be an article that says at all times the managing director will be appointed by the majority shareholder. So that kind of entrenchment could be varied. And there can also be a claim of damages against the company and its directors. So an action could be brought against the directors for fraudulent conduct. So this statutory derivative action is quite neat in that it lifts that idea of a company being a separate legal entity and allows minority shareholders who have a reasonable case to be able to bring an action. However, there are some problems. There is again the minimum number. There is a provision that says that if there is any costs, the costs has to be borne by the shareholder, which might be, a deterrent. And also there's the frivolous litigation costs. So if there's a frivolous litigation, there's a fine imposed, which seems also a bit vexatious litigation, which seems to deter people as well. So, and also it only applies to shareholders. It doesn't really apply to others who might also have rights within the company, such as debenture holders or such as hybrid security holders. So there's some criticisms. I was just going to tell you about this provision, which has been in Australia for about 20 years, and how it has ended up doing, it actually isn't used that much, but when it's used, it makes new and good law. And I was just going to tell you about a case where that was used recently. So any comments about the statutory derivative action? Do you think that's a good idea? Because it's actually removing this notion of a separate legal entity. Is that a good way to balance the rights of the minority against the majority?
It doesn't give unlimited power for the corporate way to do whatever they want to do under the pretext of unlimited liability, limited liability. And they really got what when they deliberately indulge in anything illegal.
Okay. I guess it's just very warm. Everybody seems awfully sleepy. Oh, wow. To be young and sleepy. Whereas I'm just old and sleepy. It's a sad way to be. So, there's the joke. Even the lights don't like my joke. All right, so let's talk about this assessment from Australia that I want to tell you about. It's really fascinating. So what's happened in Australia is that this is being used by parent companies and subsidiary companies. So there are cases where there is just another company. Let's just introduce another company here. Special 1 and separate legal entity 2. So in this particular case, there have been shareholders who've been shareholders of one particular company, and they have found that there is action. Oh, I should actually rub that out. They found that there is action. So these shareholders are shareholders of one particular company, but they're finding that the directors of these two companies are the same. So they're finding that these directors are actually giving a whole lot of business to another company. So what this provision, statutory derivative action, is being used for is for this particular shareholder to, in the name of separate legal entity 2, bring an action against separate legal entity 1 and the directors behind it, as well as its directors. So it's being used to bring an action against another company for stealing its clients. It's being used to bring an action against the directors of that company for assisting in breaching the law, as well as its own directors. You look a bit unconvinced.
So I mean, it's very broadly worded, so I'm sure it covers both corporate action as well as business conduct. But is that what it's really for?
Yeah, exactly. Is that what it's really for?
I'm not sure. I want to go back and have a look at it.
I don't think that's what, the section is being used in a completely different way. So I agree with you, and I'm just talking about the potential that this section can have. So the section is being used, I mean, in some ways you can ask the question, well, these directors shouldn't actually be giving away some of the business opportunities of this company to another, and they're doing it because of their position in two companies, but that's what's happening. So the case is being brought to stop that happening. And it's a pretty interesting case, and the case is True Value Solar Holdings. Yeah. True Value Solar Holdings versus Fernandez. It's an Australian case. So I just think that's something that you can see that this section could actually blow out a bit. But for it to blow out, you need other things to happen, which is where we're going next. Maybe we should all just stand up for a minute and just sort of do a little bit of touching the stars. Oh, I see. Oh, everyone has just taken embryo positions, as in we are not doing it, primarily you. Okay then, I'll just do it. Twinkle, twinkle. Okay, everyone. So let's have a look at class actions under 245, because, this is so exciting. You think, wow, it's fantastic that this section's happening. But, the more I looked at it, I was thinking, what the hell? So I was just thinking, it seems so good. So section 245, the statutory derivative action section, actually allows for a class action to be brought. So section 245 is actually saying a class action can be brought by that same number that we talked about before, 100 shareholders or 1/10 can bring a class action. Now, it seems fantastic, and presumably this has all been introduced because of, that famous, how much good that man did, the Satyam guy, for corporate law in India. So presumably it's been brought here, but I was wondering about the provision, but before I talk about it, I should ask you, India has a very big history of class actions, and you think that maybe that'll translate onto this, but I was wondering what you think about this provision. Not you, because I know you most probably have a lot to say, but maybe some of the others. We'll come back to you when others have had a chance. Anyone? Whenever you say something, I think it's just so remarkable. So maybe you can just say anything and I'll think it's remarkable. What do you think about class actions? Or maybe you shouldn't say something, then I'll think it's unremarkable. No, I'm only joking. Anybody? What about you, sir? Class actions? Osmosis happening here, trying to get it out of the air. All right. Is that it? Yeah, thank you. Anyone else?
So I think when you talk about the history of class action, I think you were referring to the public action, the ideas of public regulations that are really popular in they usually don't, involve corporate activities as like a separate head. It's more of a very generic sort of remedy where you can ask from essentially anything under the sun. You can talk about how your municipal corporation isn't, collecting garbage from your locality to, a bunch of things. So I think makes sense to quantify it and put it in a legislation and say, okay, you have the right here, because otherwise there's too much of a discretion for the courts. And to a large extent, these days it's being looked upon as a sort of nuisance of litigation where people, bring anything to the court and ask for a remedy. So it makes sense to put it in the statute and say, okay, this is a specific right that you have under this section and you can ask for it.
Okay. So you're saying it's just really codifying something that is possible anyway?
I'm saying because of the codification, it's sort of expansion of your rights. And previously there's a lot of discretion. You don't really know if you have a right there. You just have a problem and you go to the court and ask for a solution. But here there's a specific right that you're given.
So you have standing straight away. Okay. So some guidance may give you standing, so at least you know you've got 100 guys who can sort of question something. All right, so let's have a look at this particular case of Bain Capital, which has in the domestic, has anyone, I don't want to be somebody who comes, I hate this colonizing idea of coming out of the country and kind of telling people who know so much. Anyone heard of this case? No, the Bain. Okay, anyway, do you want to, no, not about the before. I've said I'd come back to you about class actions.
This is observation that though there are a lot of powers in the provision, the forum which hears class actions, which is not that, has not that been an effective forum.
Okay.
The reason why, as he said, the earlier plan, public litigation for one reason was that courts in origin should be reached the higher courts of the land area. Here it's a tribunal of the very limited class. So then you may get the power, because the scale of the company law, to hear class action, does not have the same kind of power that a high court or Supreme Court.
Great point, that it's a different place where it's heard, so with different powers. All right, so let's just have a quick look at this case. So Bain is a private equity investor, and it invested about 60 million in this company, which is Lilliput, which is making children's clothing, Lilliput Kidswear, which is a children's clothing company in India, in May 2010. And it took 30% stake in the company. However, its decision to invest was based on Ernst & Young's audited and certified reports. Now, Bain invested in the company as the company was planning to expand, and it was planning to put out a prospectus and get general public offering. But before this public offering went out, Bain was alerted by a whistleblower to the accounts of the company Lilliput and was told that the company's accounts were not in as great shape as was thought. So Bain's reaction was to stop that particular prospectus move going ahead, and they halted the process, and they forced Lilliput to actually investigate the whistleblower's claims. The claims were that there were inflated sales and the price of the company was actually much higher, the value of the company much higher than what it was in reality. So the whistleblower apparently had approached Ernst & Young, but had been dismissed, and the auditor certified the reports again. So the company was again in the clear. So when the action went to court, Bain took the action to court in India. It didn't approve the accounts, and it also took the action. Lilliput filed a case against Bain, seeking relief, saying that Bain was obstructing the company and stopping the company from proceeding. The court restrained Bain from acting in this way and said that these people were actually stopping the company from proceeding because they'd got this Ernst & Young tick that the accounts were all right following the whistleblowers' comments. So the order from the court was also not to give any further publicity to these claims and to make sure that Lilliput's interests were protected. And it was decided that, you know, another independent audit would be carried out. Apparently, Bain wrote off its investment, and it was apparently, because of course this is private, and apparently now Lilliput owns the company itself, 100% of the company, rather than the 70% that it held before. So the action in India didn't succeed in that case. But what Bain is doing now is it's actually bringing an action in Massachusetts on the basis that Ernst & Young has fraudulently aided and abetted the company to try to defraud it. It's arguing that Ernst & Young has been complicit in defrauding the company. And Bain and 10 other subsidiaries of a global private equity firm are suing Ernst & Young, claiming that they have lost their money. The reason I raised that decision is still pending. The reason I raised that decision is that it looks like you can get more joy overseas in foreign jurisdictions for these kinds of actions than you seem to be able to get in India, which again might be partly because of the way in which the Indian courts might operate, and also SEBI's discretionary power anyway in relation to listed companies. So I suppose one has to bear in mind, for class actions to work, you also need the court system to have sufficient power to be able to assist it to get along. Class actions have been going on in Australia for some time. I think it started in March 1992. That's when the statutory provision was introduced in Australia. And it's been hugely successful in corporate cases. The kinds of cases where class actions work is these kinds of cases. So a case that I can talk about is the case of GIO, which is an insurance company. The shareholders, the minority shareholders of the insurance company, found that the directors had actually hidden some of the data that was saying that the company had bad prospects, and they sued that company. The other actions have been because of auditors' reports that have actually said the company is doing really well, and that has led people to invest in the company, and they're also bringing action against the company. So there has been an enormous amount of activity among shareholders. So I'm not talking about the general public who has been buying all the product liability related cases, who have been buying products that have caused health injuries and so forth. I'm just talking about just sheer economic loss incurred by shareholders. However, they have found that there are some problems in class actions even in Australia. Firstly, who opts in and who opts out is a bit of a problem. You might get a class together of 7 people, but there might be a whole lot of other people who don't really want to actually take up that fight or retain their right to bring action later. These opt-in, opt-out provisions haven't been clarified and really need to be clarified, and people have to think about it when they're thinking of class actions. Who is actually deciding that, you know, who is that class action being made for? The other point, I think, which is important and has given rise to increased class actions is litigation funders. Litigation funders, it's commercial litigation funding. So what these guys do, they're companies that are set up to try to investigate what is the chance of a particular action succeeding. So they actually inquire into this particular case, they look at the accounts, they test, they run a dummy run of whether this action is going to succeed, and then they fund the action. So the class of shareholders who are bringing the action don't have to fork out any money. They don't have to put out any money because the action is decided on a no-win, no-fee basis. So in the first instance, the litigation funder does a very good analysis of whether there's a winnable case. The second thing is they fund the case. And the third thing is they take a cut of the fee at a later time, a very large cut usually, because it also takes care of all the costs that they've incurred in bringing the action. When a litigation funder is behind you, your action's going to win because it's already gone through so many hoops. In Australia, however, these litigation funders aren't being regulated. And there is a question about whether they owe fiduciary duties and they should be funded. So what sort of lessons can we learn for India? Well, the kinds of lessons, firstly, is you've got to have an effective court system. Secondly, you've got to clarify the opt-in, opt-out clauses. And thirdly, you've got to have somebody funding these guys because these poor guys who want to bring action are all the small shareholders that really are going to cave to the majority shareholder and sell their share and run. So if you want to clean up the act, you've got to have litigation funding happening. And I think it's going to happen because the proxy firms are already opening up and it's only a stone's throw behind proxy firms. So that's what is needed, litigation funders for class actions. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Yes?
Just with your permission, I would like to ask the class, can we have litigation funders in India? Any thoughts? What they are saying in law in Australia. Can you have litigation funders in India? Yes. Anyone read about Chapter contracts? So, law usually develop the judgments here. In India, you cannot enter into a contract which encourages litigation. Basically, we read it in Contracts Act.
Well, I guess that has to be repealed. Repeal that law. Increase litigation. We're all lawyers here. Okay, so... Yeah, and yeah, I agree. Australia has lots of problems because the litigation funding takes all the fee. Anyone else? Well, this has been a fun class, hasn't it? A lot of interaction, participation. Oh, I feel like getting on a trampoline. Oh. Anyway, it's been good fun though. Oh my God, that's going on a tape. Yes. Let's just look at tomorrow's class. We're going to do some directors. Why don't you all concentrate on, maybe forget the Malin and concentrate on the whistleblowing. It's pretty fascinating. So there's the Leighton case and there is the whistleblowing legislation. So the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which has the whistleblowing provisions, seems to be a bit of a model for encouraging proper whistleblowing and giving compensation. So I thought maybe you can have a look at that, and we'll maybe do some problem questions to get everyone's blood flowing. Any questions, comments, criticisms, praises? No. Lovely. I'll sign off on GIAN Class 4. Yes, sir.
Why we have CSR as a mandatory? Earlier it was not mandatory. Now it is after 2013 and it is mandatory. Why it is so?
Well, I guess I could ask you why they're protecting our small shareholders. Why are they codifying a statutory derivative action? Why are they including environment within directors' duties? Why are they trying to actually recognise the notion of, community?
Earlier it was non-binding. It was not obligatory to the company to pay the
Presumably because they want to make a soft law hard.
At the time of you brought about the that you directly so that the deforestation should not be done now. So this you brought about you directly
Yeah.
environmental directive now. That
The EU directive, the European Union directive, yeah?
that the deforestation should not be done. A company cannot be established in a place where there is loss of trees in work and it cannot be established on the border of deforestation. So as we are doing that, so can it be similar way to the CSR because we are expecting and we are paying just 2% of our wages to the government now. So we can cut the tree and we can construct the company into the area and we are paying paid compensation regarding to that. Can we do so now?
The CSR provisions, there's a list on the way in which CSR can be used. So I don't understand what you mean. You don't have to give 2% to the government. You can spend it on prescribed activities. So it's not just a matter of giving it to the government. You can also give it to the government, but you can also use it on prescribed activities. So I'm not sure if the kind of activity you're proposing comes within that. I don't even know what it is, actually. So you have to look at that list, which we will do. Glad to have you in this class. Keep everyone on their toes. Thank you very much. See you later.